Thank you very much for inviting me. I served a couple of terms as a director on the committee, and I've known folks who've held various positions in this august organization over the years, and it's a pleasure to come back. I was really pleased to see you're in the same place that you've been, and for as long as I can certainly remember. But the lobby looks great. I don't know when that all took place, but it sure does look good. I'm in New York. It's the first trip I'm going to make this year, 2012. I typically still do a lot of traveling. Pretty much since I was a teenager, I've been traveling internationally and doing about 40 to 50% of the time on the road. So this trip will be to New York. I'll go down to Washington for a week, and then I will speak at the University of Kentucky. They have something called Passport to the World, which is an annual event. I think last year was South Africa, this year is China, so they've asked me to keynote a public lecture, and then run around to, I hobble around to elementary schools and middle schools, and give radio and what have you. So it'll be a full 3 days. And then home to San Francisco, where I'll spend the month, and then off again, this time to Norway and Geneva, and then to Beijing from Geneva, and then Hong Kong and home. Obviously in Norway, I'll be meeting with both the government and civil society, but this time I'm also going to visit a women's prison in Norway. This is an area increasingly, if you follow what we've been up to recently, one of our new areas of focus is women in prison. This is to a certain extent related to the passing by the General Assembly in December of 2010, the Bangkok Rules. And I am struck by how few people know anything about this. In fact, when I met with the Chinese representative on the Third Committee of the UN, she had never heard of it, which is astonishing. But a lot of places, people you speak to, they haven't heard of it. The Bangkok Rules are the minimum standard treatment of women in detention and non-custodial detention. And
sorry, what's a non-custodial mean?
Home arrest, halfway houses.
I mean, it's prison as distinct from it.
Well, so women in prison, in detention, that is, women in detention, including prison, and then in non-custodial detention. I mean, they are still, the Chinese term, subject to coercive measures, but they're not actually in a prison.
So would that include like ankle bracelets?
Yeah, things like that. Yeah. So I'll visit a prison in Oslo, write it up, and try to push things forward. What I'd like to do is a seminar in China on the Bangkok Rules at some point. MFA is very interested. The Ministry of Justice is not at all interested. And I can imagine why, actually. So that's sort of my first quarter travels. Here on this trip, I've met with, had lunch with the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, and then there was a meeting with the chief representative on the Third Committee, which my son handled. My 21-year-old son, youngest boy, who's at Oberlin, writing his senior honors thesis on Sino-Tibetan talks. And the mission agreed to give him an hour one-on-one interview with their chief representative, who has been to Tibet many times, and of course, as a Chinese government official, knows very well the policy line. I think we're in for a difficult year in U.S.-China relations. It is the first time, certainly since normalization, that a change at the top of the Communist Party in China coincides with a U.S. presidential election. That's the first time. And the last time it should have happened, if you look at the 5 plus 5 and the 4 plus 4 cycle, it would have been 20 years ago, 1992. But as we all know, Jiang Zemin was already in place, having succeeded Zhao Ziyang. So that adds a certain element of tension. Those of you who watched or were able to watch the debate last night will know that Romney never misses an opportunity to hit China, and that sort of must have gotten their attention by now. And in November 13th, the press conference that President Obama gave at APEC was pretty tough. The enough is enough speech is what we call it. And that apparently followed a not very happy meeting between Hu Jintao and President Obama. I've heard different things. I must say all from the Chinese. I haven't heard the U.S. side yet, which is typical. I often find out more from talking to the Chinese than I do from our own government. But I'm going down to Washington and I'll get their take on it. But suffice to say, it was not a happy meeting. And Hu Jintao was resentful on a number of scores, one of which I understand was the photograph, the traditional big photograph. And he was placed apparently at the very end on the extreme right or left. And, President Obama was next to some vassal state. And as I was told the other day, you will never see that photograph published in China. That Hu Jintao felt very put out, slighted. So I think we're in for a tough year on a number of scores. I think that we certainly have a lot of issues between the countries. The list has not decreased at all in the years. They just keep adding. And now I guess one of the very top issues, again, what I hear from the Chinese side, is Iran. That China is really concerned that military action is on the way. And one of those issues, of course, is human rights. And I'm sure you've all noticed that our ambassador, in the last few days, really, first on Charlie Rose and then I guess with the NPR, had some very strong things to say. Now, I think he was slightly misquoted when he said that China is unstable. He responded that it's very, very very delicate and very, very sensitive. And then he talked about Wuhan. So, certainly that example in that context would lead you to think that he was, in fact, saying that things are pretty unstable. But his criticism of human rights was quite forceful. He said on both occasions that the human rights situation in China is worsening. I am always careful about saying that for one reason, and that is it is important for me to keep my access. I am told repeatedly that I am the only person they will discuss cases with. And even on this trip, I had a very interesting, I won't say with whom, but a talk on Chen Guangcheng. On that, I think the central government is genuinely pretty embarrassed by what's going on down there, and would be well served to get a grip on the situation, send some senior public security guys down there and fix it. And it would redound, I think, to China's benefit if it did such a thing. In terms of the conversation I had, I was pointing out that in our own civil rights movement, at a certain point, the feds had to step in. That local law enforcement was simply not obeying the law, and that's what the central government needs to do. And I got a fairly sympathetic hearing. So, on the one hand, I don't want to make a general comment that the situation is worsening. On the other hand, I find it hard to say objectively and truthfully that the situation is getting worse. I think it's getting worse in some respects, and it's getting better in other respects. Hence the title of my little talk here, Rights and Wrongs. There are some things that are taking place which are quite commendable. To name a few, the reform of the criminal procedure law with respect to juveniles and women, access to lawyers. You know, again, for 98% plus of criminal suspects in China, the criminal procedure law has a lot of good things in it. But for the other 2%, there are steps backward. And when I testified to Congress in November, I pointed all that out. They have taken that testimony fairly well, although I did receive an email from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressing their wish that I will be more cautious in the future when dealing with sensitive issues. Now, forgive me for sort of going off on tangents from time to time, but so we have some things that are going right. I don't want to go into the alleviation of poverty and all that. You know, I'm not an official of the Chinese government. They would, I'm sure, point all that out as they do. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning,
John. Now, why? I've been, you know, they never really tell you why would the MFA send me such an email, you know, wishing me a happy new year and long life and much happiness and everything, but Mr. Kamm, we hope you will treasure our cooperation and dialogue.
In English or Chinese?
English. Treasure.
Must have been fun writing the whole thing back to them.
Oh, he did.
Yeah.
And that you should be more cautious in dealing with sensitive issues. And I replied in saying, well, you know, I thank you very much. I accept that from time to time I am not sufficiently cautious. I said, but at the same time, I wish you were less cautious in dealing with sensitive issues. No, I'll let Chen Guangcheng, but I didn't say that per se. Well, what could they be referring to? And one, I suppose, was the testimony. They, you know, there I am before the most hostile committee in Congress, chaired by Ross Leitonen and Dana Rohrbacher and Ed Royce, and you know, these were people, by the way, when I was testifying in favor of Most Favored Nation in 1990, at the very first hearings, I was the first person to testify in favor of retaining MFN. They were all against it. They were all in Congress, they're all senior now, and they were all, to a man and a woman, opposed. So there I am, you know, and I was wondering at what point do they, you know, go after me, and they didn't. They were Ross Leitonen was very kind to me, and they kind of let me get out of there without having to do battle. It was just very nice, etc. So I was wondering, maybe it's the testimony, but you know what? I don't think it was the testimony that they're referring to. I wonder if anyone, if you follow what we do or what we say, might wonder what it was that sort of got this kind of response. Well, I will just jump right in and tell you what I think, and not give you a chance to tell me what you think. Been in China too long. I think it was our work on the death penalty, the number of executions. Now, on December 8th, more or less, we issued a statement which I believe, for the first time, provides a reasonably accurate estimate of the number of executions taking place in China today. That estimate was based on statements by Chinese participants in the first United Nations seminar with the Chinese government on the death penalty. That took place in Hangzhou, December 1st through the 3rd. And at that, at least 2 of the Chinese participants stated that in the 4 years since the Supreme People's Court took back, took back because they used to have it, the right of final review, executions had dropped by 50%. Well, it just so happens that one of those same participants was a scholar, had made an estimate for 2006 of 8,000, and we, Dui Hua, had independently, based on our own sources in China, also come up with an estimate of 8,000. And that number, 8,000, had been referenced in a Xinhua news account on China's, a foreign human rights organization says. So, putting these things together, we came up with this 4,000 number. Now, the Chinese government has neither confirmed nor denied, which, I suppose is neither here nor there. But I think it's now when you see references to executions, they just executed 15 people in one day, I think in Wuhan. It's in there. China executes 4,000 people a year. I think they were probably referring to that when they talked about sensitive issues, that I should be more cautious. But anyway, it's out there, and I'm still meeting and getting some information on cases. Most recently, the case of probably China's oldest political prisoner. He's a 95-year-old fellow who's serving a sentence on medical parole. Remember, when you're on medical parole, you're still serving your sentence. So he's with his family. And when, medical parole, by the way, is not always appreciated because, the history of medical parole is, they go on medical parole, then they go abroad. But actually, medical parole is granted for specific periods. Often it's an initial period of 6 months. In this guy's case, it's a 3-year. And the information I was given is okay, when the medical parole is over, he can go back to prison. I don't think they're going to send a 96-year-old guy back to prison, but it's possible under the law. So we're kind of working behind the scenes to make sure that doesn't happen, and I'm pretty confident it won't happen. So getting back then, okay, actually, here's a right and a wrong. I mean, one of the interesting things about talking about human rights in China is that something can be good and bad at the same time. The good news is they've reduced executions by 50%. The bad news is they execute 4,000 people a year. That's the reality of working in this area in China. So that's something that's both right and wrong. With respect to juvenile crime, it's really, I think, really astonishing that they have moved so quickly and decisively to introduce elements of Western juvenile justice into their system. Now, as we all know in China, it all depends on implementation. And in the United States, which of course has plenty of problems in their juvenile justice systems, because there is no one system. Every county has their own. Some counties have public defenders, others don't. It's a hodgepodge of different systems. But there's certain common elements to these systems, one of which we call diversion. And the Chinese have introduced something called postponed prosecution or suspended prosecution, which is basically the same thing as diversion. In China today, we estimate, based on statistics, that about 100,000 juveniles are detained every year. And more than 60%, between 60 and 70%, wind up being incarcerated, either in juvenile prisons or more commonly in something called work-study schools, which is the juvenile equivalent of re-education through labor. In San Francisco, it's about 12%. In Europe, it's well under 10%. And the reason is that all of these countries, North America, Europe, have diversion as a juvenile policy. And this is in the new criminal procedure law. And the other very important development in respect to that is what we call sealing of records in this country, which is really expunging of records. In China today, that doesn't exist. So if you go to a juvenile prison for robbery when you're 16 and you serve a 2-year sentence, say, that stays with you for life. You're a marked person. And in the criminal procedure law, they have a provision for expunging of records, sealing of records. And that's a great step forward. But again, if you look at the municipalities that have started to experiment with them, if you're a juvenile and you are convicted of endangering state security, no expunging. And so, of course, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, but certainly in Xinjiang, you got a lot of young people who participate in anti-government protests. That's with them for life. I don't think we should be naive, I guess, to think that they would have exempted. No. So, again, the good news is that they're introducing it. The bad news is they're continuing this, what I refer to in my testimony as the perpetuation of a dual-track system. If you're one of the 99%, the criminal procedure law is pretty good, right? Guaranteed access to counsel, various new protections against torture, in death penalty review. It's a real review. I mean, you get your defense. Right now, your defense lawyer doesn't get to participate. The Supreme Court reviews it. If they say the paperwork looks good, that's it. But now witnesses can be called. The defense lawyer can represent you before the Supreme Court. All these things are in the criminal procedure law. So these are steps in the right direction. Well, what's wrong, I've already referred to it, is the perpetuation and reinforcement of what is, in effect, a dual-track system. And I outlined this in my testimony. I'm not going to go through it again. But basically, from the moment that you are suspected of having committed a crime of endangering state security, the great majority of which are nonviolent speech and association crimes, right? The 4 crimes: subversion, incitement to subversion, splitism, incitement to splitism. Those 4, in our database, 74% of all known ESS arrests are for one of those 4 crimes. Endangering state security. I'm sorry, I always use that. And I was told in your testimony, please don't say that. You have to say it the whole time. But endangering state security. So there we are. Now,
What's the number in your database?
I think we have over 1,000 cases of arrests going back to 1997, which they changed the law. So some of these people are out already. I don't have I could send you the details, the current breakdown. We have about 25,000 records in our database, which is by far the biggest in the world. And, those of you who are familiar with our work know that what I think distinguishes Dui Hua is the commitment we have made to doing what I call open source research. And I brought along, actually, the next volume of our reference material series. It's about to come out again. And there's some, what we do in these. By the way, I want to do this online starting at the end of the year. I'll do 2 more of these, and then just put everything online and not wait every 4 months to do one of these. So when we find something like this is just extraordinary. This is from the Beijing Prison Yearbook for 2006, and it's the register of prisoners in their 17 facilities.
It's published?
Yeah. Yep.
Safe to be a state secret.
Well, maybe neighbor, but we got it in China in a library. We go into the libraries, and there's one library in the United States right now, which I'm not going to mention, but which has been assiduous in collecting the kind of materials we need. But here's the register, and it's full of really interesting information, including the following. At the end of 2005, out of a total population of 14,507 prisoners in the Beijing prison system, just Beijing.
Small considering the population.
Well, there's an ongoing debate about this. That China, is often points out that our number of inmates is per capita much higher. But remember, this doesn't include re-education through labor.
Yeah.
It doesn't include other forms of administrative detention. For instance, it doesn't include Kong, the psychiatric detention facilities. It doesn't include shorong jiaoyu, custody and education, which is used for pimps and prostitutes. It doesn't include enforced drug rehabilitation. So this is, these are people convicted and actually in prison. So of that 14,507, there were 305 Falun Gong prisoners, making up 2.1% of the prison population. Now, at the end of 2005, China had a prison population of 1.6 million prisoners. Official number from the Ministry of Justice. Do the math. If that percentage applied to the country as a whole, you would have 33,600 Falun Gong prisoners, not including RTL, re-education through labor. And we know that Falun Gong makes up a very significant percentage of RTL. In fact, when the EU visited the Daxing re-education through labor camp around this time, I think in 2006, the warden told them that 70% of the inmates were Falun Gong, and the EU reported it. Now, I think that may be a special situation, but in any event, certainly there are a large number of Falun Gong participants, practitioners in re-education through labor. There's another form of administrative detention, which applies to, among others, seriously poisoned Falun Gong practitioners. Those are the prisoners who go through re-education but are not re-educated. And this is an indefinite detention, and it's called, I think, legal education schools. Centers, legal education centers. And these are detention facilities which are in effect used to detain people indefinitely. I became aware of it because of a case I worked on at the request of a member of Congress. In the event, the woman was released, but it was quite an education, and I was told, in fact, that there are quite a few of these.
Are these exclusively for Falun Gong?
No, but my impression is that people who are in re-education who simply resist, and even after the 1-year extension, which is provided for under the regulations, so you can be sentenced to 3 years and get an extra year. At the end of that, if you're still not re-educated, you go into one of these facilities. Now, it stands to reason that if you're someone who believes passionately in a particular religion or set of beliefs, that you're going to be less likely than a professional pickpocket to refuse to be re-educated. You re-educate and get out of there, and then go back to picking pockets. But, So I point this out again. We continue to unearth these very interesting materials, some of which are dated in the sense that they come onto bookshelves or become available through various sources, and they're a few years old. And for those, we typically put them in our reference materials. So for my new website, which we've launched, we're going to have, of course, the newsletter. And the newsletter is increasingly going to be directed towards, policy type things, and international in nature. So maybe an article on the death penalty forum in Hangzhou, maybe an article on U.S.-China relations with respect to human rights, how it fits in. So that kind of thing will be more and more in the newsletter. Then we'll have our Human Rights Journal, which we have now. And that is, hello, Jan.
Good morning.
That is going to be on things that have just been published, very current. And so I don't know if it's up today, but the Xinjiang court, the High People's Court of Xinjiang, has just for the first time published their work report. And among other things, they state that endangering state security trials rose 10.1% last year, 2011.
This is only in English, not in Chinese.
No, in Chinese. It's all in Chinese.
It's all in Chinese.
And
Your report is what
and my good friend and former colleague Josh is still contributing, and he found that, and I asked him to write it up, and so we will do that, and we will publish that. He also the only other province he was able to find was Sichuan, and they're a very low number of endangering state security trials, which was surprising, given that, of course, in Sichuan you have a very large Tibetan area, and one would have thought there would have been more trials. But be that as it may, we do that kind of thing. So if we find something like that, we put it up on our journal. For reference materials, we're going to be doing more of this. So it'll be reference materials online, and when we find something like this, we'll publish it. We'll do a quick analysis and get it up there. But I'm moving completely away from it's a laborious and I think inefficient way of getting this material out. Well, I know that the purpose of this kind of a session is to have a good exchange and question and answers. I think what I've tried to do here is to say that there are good things taking place, and there are steps forward, there are steps backward, there are steps forward and backward at the same time. It's a complicated picture. And again, I hope that explains why I resist, to the extent possible, of making general statements along the lines that the situation is getting worse and worse. Since I've been doing this work for 22 years now, I think every year I've heard it's getting worse and worse. At some point, it's sort of like the old limbo bar. I mean, how low can you go? What is worse than, last year was worse, this is worse. I mean, we have to adopt, I think, a more comprehensive view and recognize that, by the way, when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs replied to Gary Locke, the point they made was, the majority of Chinese people are satisfied with the way things are going. Now, again, that too is a generalization. That's a statement for them to make. But if you look at the criminal law, if you look at the criminal procedure law, the reforms in the criminal procedure law will positively affect the great majority of Chinese citizens if implemented. And I say if implemented, just on juvenile justice as an example. Yeah, it's great to have diversion, but in this country, having that as a practice requires having a professional group of individuals called probation officers, juvenile probation officers. Now, we have probation officers for adults, but this is a very, in San Francisco, I think there are something like 20 of these. In China, there are none. And when we host the Supreme Court later this year, and they'll spend a week with us in the Bay Area, the focus is going to be on training probation officers. How are you going to do this? So it does boil down to implementation. It's great to have it in the law, but if you don't have probation officers, how are you going to divert juveniles from the system? Because it is the responsibility of the probation officer to make sure that works. That they're checking up on them and monitoring them and making sure they do their homework and stay away from those bad people and all that other stuff. If you don't have them, how can you implement the system? So I do think that there have been some good things that have happened. At the same time, we see some backward movements, certainly, with respect to political prisoners. And the treatment, certainly this just every day, literally every day, we get more news, a new case, longer sentences. Just since Christmas, you've had Chun Shi, Chun Wei, Li Tie, I guess, a couple of days ago, and so on. And Wang Li Hong is out, but she's been warned. Ai Weiwei was called in, I think, a couple of days ago. And as you know, Hu Jia has been called in twice. And on this is one other thing that we found out through a dialogue with the Chinese. They've resurrected these 1995 regulations on the management of criminals who've been granted parole, medical parole, suspended sentences, deprivation of political rights. So, in effect, these regulations allow the Ministry of Public Security authorities to disappear people, as in the case of Hada, or to monitor them so strictly, as in the case of Hu Jia, that they are in effect under house arrest. So that's another trend we're seeing. I mean, they are. It's the old rule by law. They want to, put in place laws and regulations that provide a legal basis for what they're doing. And so now they called in Hu Jia because they say he has violated the terms of his release. Well, what does that mean? He's under deprivation of political rights, right? So he then falls under these regulations. And these regulations allow the Public Security Bureau to do almost anything to you to make sure that you observe the terms of deprivation of political rights, among which is you don't give interviews, you stay away from certain people, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'd like to open it to questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I have scads of questions, but I won't go first. Will you? Go ahead.
What about
Why don't you introduce yourself, because you weren't here when we did that.
I'm Bill Armbruster. I'm a semi-retired freelance journalist, former colleague of John from many years ago with the U.S.-China Business Council. What about other religious minorities besides the Falun Gong? If you count those as religious, what about Catholics, for example? Are arrests of them increasing, decreasing, or staying about the same?
Probably, with respect, okay, each religion is managed differently. The problem with the Catholics is the problem with the Tibetan Buddhists, and that is they have a spiritual leader who is based outside of China. And that's something that the Chinese government has found very difficult to accept and understand and what have you. For several years, about 3 years, it looked as though China and the Vatican would reach modus vivendi, which would eventually lead to normalization of relations. That seems to have broken down. It has broken down. The Chinese postponed the annual meeting of the Catholic Patriotic Association for several years running. I'm sure Maggie at Seton Hall has heard a lot of this. But then suddenly they held a meeting, and they began to consecrate bishops without Vatican approval. And they had made some progress in these discussions that were taking place. I'm fine, thanks. But maybe Herb. It was all about sort of trying to find a concordant type situation where the Pope would still authorize the consecration, but the Chinese would pick the candidates for the bishoprics. And it used to, for a while, it was the Chinese would put somebody up, the Vatican say yes or no, and then if the Vatican said no, they'd do it anyway. But then they moved to this, okay, 2 candidates, and you choose one of 2. And my understanding is the Vatican was holding out for 3. And they never got there. It broke down. And so at present, we have that situation. What do you have with the Catholics? The difference, one of the big differences in terms of the Catholic Church and the Protestant denominations in China, aside from the fact that the Protestants don't have a pope, is the sort of the demographics, the geographic spread. In China, the Protestants are pretty well spread out. There are various Protestant denominations, sort of all over the place. There are some places that, relatively speaking, have a higher percentage of Protestants than other places, but they're pretty evenly spread out. In China, with the Catholics, that's not the case. With the Catholics, you have very high concentrations of Catholics in certain areas, like Hebei and Baoding and Qinhuangdao. You have villages which are entirely Catholic. You'll have other parts of the country like that, where and it dates back to the historic era, for instance, in eastern Guangdong during the Great Famine at the beginning of this last century. The Catholics went in, fed the people, and converted whole areas. So that poses another threat to the security apparatus. That it's, as I say, in parts of Hebei, it's 100% Catholic. You'll have villages with thousands of people, all of whom are Catholic, and that has posed some problems. So what happens with Catholics? Although certainly there are several Catholics in RTL, we're not aware of anyone. When I started this work in the early 90s, there were several Catholics in prison, and that we're not aware of Catholics in prison. I think the last one, from time to time one goes in. This guy was convicted of illegal publishing, I believe. But certainly there are some in RTL. But mostly it's various forms of house arrest. And, it's sort of a Chun Guangcheng situation, but probably not quite so severe. So that's going on with the Catholics. Islam, of course, I think, beyond Falun Gong maybe even. I think that the Endangering State Security number for Xinjiang reflects this religious education campaign that's been going on. And we're aware of quite a few cases of people who have been arrested, at least. And, getting information on trials and convictions is very difficult in Xinjiang.
And Protestants and the house churches?
House churches, certainly people are in RTL. I'm not, again, aware. I'll have to check that, whether there are any actually in prison convicted. But by and large, as with so many other things, if you do it right, in the sense that you don't, sort of shove it in their face, there's a lot going on. A lot of Protestant denominations have people going in. Our next issue of the newsletter, we have found a number of cases of Koreans doing Christian proselytizing in the Northeast. And for the first time, we always think, okay, you've got the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and, that's sort of it. But in fact, there are other ethnic minorities that have political prisoners. And apparently the Koreans, we found a bunch of names of Koreans who've been imprisoned for illegal religious activity or, helping North Korean refugees get to Mongolia, which is the favorite route out. I'm going to let you direct traffic here.
I just have just a quick basic question. One, what is the percentage of, or I guess the ratio of men to women in prisons and executions?
Mm-hmm.
And then what is there an age minimum of execution? Is it 18? Is there, I'm just a little bit curious.
Yeah, okay. Well, China for many years has prohibited the execution of people under the age of 18. So 18 is the starting point.
Except for crimes committed under 18, not that you committed a crime when you're 16, but they can be executed after they're 18.
No.
No, exactly.
No. If you commit the crime before 18, then even if they catch you when you're 21, they don't execute. So that's the law. And in the criminal procedure law, I think they set the limit at 70.
The criminal law came down as part of the review. In the criminal law, they changed it to 70 or 75 as part of the
70,
revisions that came out last year.
Yeah, so there's the upper limit is 70, but there's again pressure to reduce that too. We don't know the ratio of women to men in executions. I imagine it's not terribly different from the ratio of women to men in prison. And there we do have some statistics. At present, the last number we have, I think, for women was 5.1 or 5.2% women making up prisoners.
What is it in the U.S.?
About 8. But the interesting thing is, in China, the percentage is growing year by year. So that, again, when I first started doing this work back in 1990, I remember having a conversation about prisoners with the Ministry of Justice, and I was told that around 2% of the population, prison population, was made up of women. And, they're starting to push towards 6%, which tripled in 20 years. Actually, again, very interesting why I think there should be an exchange, at least, between people in this country and people in China. Domestic violence is the principal cause, although drugs is certainly, and executions take place of women who are, drug runners. But in terms of the principal cause for incarceration, it's domestic violence. A woman just has had enough, and that's it. The guy goes to sleep, and she takes a hammer to him.
She puts rat poison in the chiffon.
Yeah, exactly, or something like that. And in China, as the economy has grown and social tensions have grown and pressures increase, there's certainly a big increase in domestic violence, according to the Chinese government itself. I met with one of their top experts on women, both in prison and women violence, and it's it's an epidemic. That's all you can say. A very high percentage of Chinese families have a domestic violence problem, and one of the results of that is an increase in the number of women in prison. So this is a really fertile area for exchange.
Is there any rural-urban difference in that?
I don't have enough statistics. We just don't know enough about the issues. I don't know. I just saw that now half of the Chinese population live in cities,
Yeah,
so
right.
it's hard to know. It's hard to know, but again, I point this out. In December of 2010, the General Assembly, by consensus, adopted what are known as the Bangkok Rules, and the Bangkok Rules because it was a princess, a Thai princess, who lobbied governments to get this done. It's a great story, actually. I went to law school in New York, and she returned to Thailand, and she is the king of Thailand's only granddaughter. So she's not just any old Thai princess. And she went into a woman's prison, and was so moved by what she saw. One of the prisoners prostrated herself before her, and she was very moved. She began this work, and traveling around the world, meeting with governments. It's pretty easy for government officials to say, "Go to hell, Mr. Kamm, I'm not seeing you." It's kind of very difficult for them to do that if it's the Princess of Thailand. They don't do that. So she went, and she's gone to all these different countries, and it was adopted by consensus. So both China and the United States have signed on, if that's the right phrase for this. But nobody knows. Nobody's talking about it. There have been. I checked with really the top person, if ever you're interested in doing something in this area, is a woman by the name of Rachel Brett. She works in Geneva for the Quakers. The Quakers have been leaders in this area. And we've been in regular contact for the last year and a half. And she says, to her knowledge, there has never been a bilateral exchange between two countries devoted to discussing issues related to women in prison. Never.
Any two countries?
Any two. You'll have something like a human rights dialogue, in which there'll be, a representative of a ministry that is familiar with, but no, and I think again some kind of a conference in Beijing, which would be great, devoted to the Bangkok Rules. and what different countries are doing to implement the rules. Now, we, by the way, the good old USA record in this respect is, as you might be not surprised to hear, is pretty bad. We are one of the very few countries in the world that still practice in, 42 of 50 states allow for it. I don't know how much is actually done, but shackling of women in childbirth. Yeah, it happens. It still happens. And sometimes the shackles are kept on for the entire birthing.
There was a story about that in
Yeah,
the Times.
there was a story about that recently. It happens. And that is absolutely verboten. It's just one of the worst things you can do. In the state of California, I went to visit the largest women's prison in the United States, and I was told that the child is taken away within 48 hours. Which, again, in China, one of the things in the criminal procedure law, the draft law, is that the women can now serve lifers, women sentenced to life in prison, can nurse their child outside of prison for a period of time that the local prison authority allows. But in places like Thailand, that can be several years.
Is that considered medical parole, or is that something else?
I think it's nursing parole. I don't know what they call it, but it's a it's a form of parole. It's a form of parole. But imagine in the United States, a woman prisoner sentenced to life in prison being allowed to go home to nurse her child. It's it's unthinkable. So I've been told by our good friends at the State Department that the Bureau of Prisons is not too keen on letting people see what's going on in our women's prisons, and the Chinese aren't either. I think, in large part, because as I just mentioned, you've had a tripling of the percentage, more than a tripling in the absolute numbers, because the overall prison population has increased, but the percentage has gone up for women. And there have been relatively few, some, but relatively few, women's prisons built. And so you probably have a pretty serious overcrowding issue. Certainly in our prisons you do. I mean, you walk into a cell and, there's 8 women in a place that should have 2. By the way, there's the differences, as you might imagine, between women in prison and men in prison are so very different, as you might expect in many respects. For instance, in California at least, gangs are not, women don't form gangs in prison, or they don't belong to gangs. Yes, there's some connections, but women can and do share cells together. There's not that kind of, in male prison there's segregation. If you're a member of the Crips or you're a member of some other gang, you're not put in a cell with a gang member. In women's prison, that is not that big an issue, and also they form these social units. So that the older women, you'll have a woman who's maybe 55, 60, takes on the role of, say, a grandmother, and then you have a mother, and then you have a daughter, and you have these kind of units that are formed. It's quite an interesting area for study and for reform. We learn things and hopefully can be put into practice. But I've been told that the United States, the Bureau of Prisons, wants nothing to do with this. And it's interesting. So we had the State Department saying, "Oh, John, that's a really good idea," but the Bureau of Prisons, and in China, MFA, same thing. "Oh, that's a great idea. Keep pushing, keep pushing." Ministry of Justice doesn't want to do it. This last time, Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, "Look, we can't persuade them to be the principal host. Why don't you try?" And they gave me some ideas. Beijing Law School. University Law School, maybe do a law school. See if you can get the procurator to do it, because they have inspection authority over prisons, so maybe they'll do it. And I went to the procurator, and they said, "Yeah, good idea, but very sensitive."
There's a surprise.
Anyway, so that's that issue that we're working on, women in prison.
I was just going to say there's, I don't know if you've ever heard of some blog / website called China Smack.
Uh-huh.
Well, I saw, it was like a 5-minute video thing, and I think it was at a women's prison in Wuhan, but it kind of, it was like a diary of a woman's last, 48 hours before she was gonna be executed, and it's just really interesting to see the dynamic between the female prisoners and the female guards.
Yes.
And, there's the guards going out and getting her various last requests of meals, 4 hours before she was sentenced to go, leave the prison to go to the execution ground or whatever. She decided she didn't like how she looked in the shirt she was wearing, so they went out and bought her a different shirt.
Yeah, no,
Very interesting,
I've seen that, and it's gotten a fair amount of coverage.
Yeah.
These photographs and the video of it.
Right.
In fact, CBS News did a report
Oh, really?
based
Right.
on this, and
Yeah,
I was featured for a few seconds. My 10 seconds of fame on CBS News, but. It appears to be the case that she didn't realize until quite soon before she was executed that she would be executed. And that is, I have encountered that in another big case I worked on, the Wei Han case of someone who was executed for espionage. And in that case, it was very unusual in the sense that we were able to track it all the way through the process, right up to the execution. And in that case, he was allowed a family visit, so his wife and daughter, one of the daughters, came to see him. And it was clear he had no idea. Hi, what are you doing here? I have full confidence in the Chinese justice system. I will be exonerated, and what do you say? I mean, and they came out, and then this is the story of the human rights dialogue between the EU and China. And the EU, obviously, this is the father of 2 EU citizens who was going to be executed, and they were insistent that obviously they worked very hard to have the execution commuted, the sentence commuted. But on a very kind of practical level, they just could not countenance this execution taking place literally during the dialogue. And the MFA, I believe, worked hard to at least make that happen, and they failed. And but they were, the family was given hope. They said, "Oh, you'll have one more visit," because another daughter was flying in. So the family thought that, hey, maybe, we were pulling out all the stops to save this guy. It was just a terrible travesty of justice. But in the event, he was executed. And how did people find out he was executed? Well, the MFA was saying nothing. But on the last day of the dialogue, this guy who was executed and his partner in crime, so there were 2 guys, 2 elderly people in their 60s who were executed. Please, me too. We're in the same boat. We're in the same boat. We can talk like this. This guy took to sort of hanging out across the street from the court. The executions take place in Beijing in a court, and it's. Well, the court has a facility for carrying out executions. Yeah, you don't go into prison, and you're not taken from prison to be executed in China. You're either held in a detention center, or you're held in a sort of a holding cell in the court area. So you never actually. Well, you're in a detention center, but then you're taken to trial, and then you're held after the verdict and before the death sentence. You're in this area. And so he would hang out in this little tea shop across the street and befriend the guards and things. So on the morning that it happened, these 2 guys came across in the street, and they're having tea, and he said, "Oh, what kind of a day have you had?" "Oh, it's been a tough day. We had to execute 2 old guys today." And then, "Oh, well, can you tell me anything about it?" And they described, and it was his father. And that's how we all found out. But the diplomats didn't find out until literally at the end of the dialogue. And then, they demanded a meeting with the vice minister, and, it was a big and for a while the EU debated whether to cancel the whole dialogue process. It really very nearly caused a major rupture, and I'm sure it had an impact, and has continued to have an impact. Part of it is, I suppose, the feeling that, well, with all the best intentions on the part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when it comes to this kind of thing, they have very little influence.
You wanted to ask?
Yeah, well, first a few points with the prison overcrowding. Of course, California, which was at 200%. Then last summer, the Supreme Court said you had to get down to 137.5% because you're violating the Eighth Amendment. So,
right.
Yes, this has gotten to the point after years and years of saying enough already.
Yeah.
But it's still, I think that's interesting that that's okay if you're just only, that much over. And also with the domestic violence, and I know the ABA Rule of Law Initiative has been working on that area, which I think is great, and that's been something they've been involved in. And with women in execution, I'd be interested in, of course, we can't get these numbers, what percentage of women sentenced to death are sentenced with a 2-year reprieve, which is generally then commuted into, and when we say life, China doesn't have life without parole. Like we have, basically, as people call it death in prison who don't like it because you have no chance of getting out ever. Life sentences have increased, and part of the reforms to the criminal law with the bringing down, putting a maximum age on who could be executed was also saying if you get commuted from death sentence to a long prison sentence, that they extended that time, but you still 20 years maybe or so you're going to be out. So it's not not really life, which I think is one of the times that translation doesn't really capture. But my question is about the criminal procedure law, because of course we had the draft in August. 80,000 comments came out on the website. Right. Then we get this news right around Christmas that there's the second draft has been read, but they didn't release the draft. But we did hear there was some shifting and a little bit of as far as notice or lack thereof with detention, and there were some changes, but it didn't sound like any massive overhaul occurred. What have you heard about the revised draft, and what should we see passing in March?
Right. Okay, here too, we've just put out a blog on this, Human Rights Journal. There was this sort of, the headlines were that enforced disappearance, declared illegal or, taken out of the draft and all this stuff. And in fact, what we now, some people with access to, who have seen it, have written. And so, as you mentioned, what the change is that people who have been formally arrested, the relatives of them are to be notified.
So
Daibu, but other coercive measures, no. Residential surveillance and detention, the law has not been changed. So, it's really pretty. In other words, you can still be held in residential surveillance for 6 months without family notification in an undisclosed area. That's that's what we understand based on some authoritative comment. Now there's going to be one more reading, and then it goes to the NPC. So there's still an outside chance that the most pernicious parts of the draft, and with respect to enforced disappearance, will be. There's still a chance, but I'm doubtful that the. Again, my understanding is that it was a lot of horse trading over this. It's been a long process, years. I think 8 years.
So the boy who cried wolf. This year we're going to do the CPO. Next.
Yeah, it's been, and there's been. One can almost imagine, okay, the cops might give on juveniles and say, all right, we'll buy into this, but in return, we want to be able to disappear people under the law. So, I think that kind of thing is going on.
In the U.S., you have quite a difference of opinion, if one can believe these surveys, between people who are running justice system and prison system and population at large, in New York probably outstanding one is that these very tough laws about sentence and locking up people who are involved with drugs when it's very expensive.
Yeah.
People like to get out of it, and the cops are bored with it. But if you do a survey, it's lock them up and throw the key away and execute. I mean,
Sure.
there's quite a difference between them. Now, in China, I mean, if I see people from China less often go to China, you say, what's going on that you want to complain about? They'll complain about railroad tickets, or they'll complain about corruption and powers over. Nobody ever seems to complain about the justice system. And I have volunteered, we're cutting down our executions here, not because of the Europeans were getting compassionate, but because it seems an awful lot of mistakes were made, and no one wants to spend money on so many defense lawyers, so we're just sort of reducing it. What about in China? And you get back, well, we shouldn't keep people, alive forever, feeding them, it's too expensive, we should have more executions. So you seem to get a very different sort of laobaixing attitude on these things. This is very anecdotal,
Yeah.
and I'm just appealing to you. What do the Chinese think of the kind of things we're discussing?
Well,
Because that's where the changes.
No, I think actually there's some really interesting correspondences between the United States and China, for instance, in the area of capital punishment. In both countries, a majority of people support it. The most recent poll, it's over 60% of Americans support capital punishment. In China, it's probably in the 60 to 70% range easily. It's still very popular. Interestingly, as you point out, the people who actually carry out the executions after they've done a few start to take a different view of taking a life. Also, in both countries, there have been in recent years important reforms. The Roper case, in our country now, it's unconstitutional to execute people under the age of 18. And we did execute up until 2005, right? Now, I'm not up to speed on this, but this debate in this country about whether juveniles can be sentenced to life without parole.
They can only be sentenced to life without parole for homicides, but if it's anything else, they can't.
So, but you're getting some movement in the direction of reform, and in China as well. But that doesn't seem to have affected the fundamental popularity. Now, the history of movements, abolition movements in other countries, is when you can get 100% certain that this person has been wrongfully executed. That's why so many people who are for abolition, including myself, of the death penalty, are working to find that one absolutely 100% certain a guy is executed, and then a year later, a guy comes forward and says, I did it, here's the proof, here are the trophies I took from the women, I did it. You executed the wrong man. We haven't had that yet.
Zhao Tuohai was pretty close there.
Very close,
And
very
Ye
close.
Shibin and Shi Shanglian, there is a number
Well,
of
I'm saying in
cases.
China.
That's what I'm saying. In China,
Yeah.
there are several cases.
In China, I don't know what the attitude is towards that. In the United States, I'm talking about the United States.
Yeah.
In the United States, I think there would be, as in Britain, the case of the guy there who was executed wrongfully, and then they found the guy who did it. It was such a public revulsion.
That hasn't happened here?
Apparently, they haven't gotten that case for sure. We've had all kinds of people who've been taken off death row because DNA evidence is exonerated, etc. A large number. And it stands to reason that someone has been wrongfully executed. But I don't believe we still can say, okay, this guy was wrongfully executed for 100% sure. And until that happens, we're still looking for it. In China, yes, I think there have in fact been wrongful executions, and I don't know what the public, in the States, it's better to release 100 guilty than to execute one innocent. I don't know in China culturally what the attitude towards that would be. I talked to a Chinese shop lady one time, anecdotal, and it was very much we're not executing enough. Basically, their attitude.
does the law or practice in China mainland in any way reflect what was the Taiwan law and practice? And that was, parricide, if you killed your father, you were dead. If you killed your little sister, that was regrettable. And it was handled very, very differently.
Yeah. Again, what we're seeing are Supreme Court statements that we have to reduce only in the most serious crimes and, this kind of thing. And the other element is if you're on trial for murder and you agree to compensate the family of the victim, I mean, it's the Chinese equivalent of blood money, you can, in fact, escape the death penalty. Now, I've only been in one trial in China. I was allowed into a trial, but quite by happenstance. They had allowed me to attend a trial in Beijing, and it was a complete, show trial. Complete, brought the guy in, he pleaded guilty, he threw himself on the mercy of the court. The judge was very kind and solicitous and gave him a light sentence, and the cameras were filming me the whole time, watching all this. It took months to get this approved in Beijing. And this is a very interesting area. Trials are open except for trials in 3 areas. But, and this is in Beijing, if you're a foreigner and you want to attend a trial, you have to get the permission of the relevant departments. And what you do is you apply to the court, and the court applies to Beijing municipality for you as a foreigner to attend a trial. Well, here's the problem. Trials are announced, I think it's 48 hours in advance, and they put them up on the board. And it takes 4 days to get permission. So you apply, and then you get permission, but the trial is over. So I actually got a number for the number of foreigners allowed into the Haidian District Court to observe trials, and it was a minuscule. In Guangzhou, it's different. Maybe it's because there's such a back and forth, people from Hong Kong mostly. I just walked in. I registered. My local interlocutor took me in, registered, and there was a trial going on for a robbery. And I get into the court, and it's a young man, 19 years old. He looked younger than my kid. I always remember his boy. I mean, he was on trial, and the case was that he had a lover's quarrel with his girlfriend, and he had taken her cell phone, which he had given to her, and it was, and they got into a fight, and he grabbed a knife and he stabbed her, and she died. So this is all unfolding before me, and he's a poor migrant worker, and her family is in the court, and they, the court took out a schedule. If you're 19 or 20 years old and you're a woman, 60,000 renminbi or whatever it was, compensation. If you're a male, it's 120 or 100, whatever. And the age and the sex, and there's a and then the guy, the judge, asked the young man, "Well, are you in a position to compensate?" And he said, "I have no money. I have no money. My family is poor." And at this point, the defense lawyer, to his credit, said, I should mention that the judge sort of decided after listening to the case that, no, this isn't robbery, this is murder. Okay, we're going to do murder. And then that's when the compensation thing entered. And the family is in there, I'm sitting there, and they have this negotiation, and the defense lawyer say, "Your Honor, you can't be saying that, because he can't pay money, that he's going to be executed, and if he can, he won't be," and he sort of gavelled the proceedings. And of course, this is where it gets, quite absurd. The judge and I hung out. we went into an adjacent room and we smoked a few cigarettes. And I don't usually smoke, but I was smoking that day. And I smoked with him, and we drank tea. And I said, look, Your Honor, this in the United States, this would not be first-degree murder. This, would be crime of passion, involuntary, blah blah blah. Oh, says, would you like to take my picture? I said, so then we went back into the courtroom, and I still have this photo. He's in his robes, and I'm there, and he just told the family to get out of the courtroom, and then like a few weeks later, I got this news clipping that he'd been sentenced to death. So I wrote the judge a letter, and I said, hey, I thought, we had a nice conversation and everything, and this to me, again, clearly, it's a crime of passion. It shouldn't be a murder. And the guy, on appeal, it was reversed, and it was given, death with 2-year reprieve. And they've done actually studies that the average length of time that someone serves who's had a sentence commuted, you commute from death to death with 2-year reprieve, and then to a fixed term or life. But that the average, I think, is 15 years.
Yeah, 17.
So, my Chinese friend said, well, he'll be out in his mid-30s, So, but, it was quite an experience to witness that. But to your point, I mean, in China, if you can, there was that case of, where was it? It was in Yunnan, where the court overturned the death penalty, and there was this big uproar, and then they reinstated it. But if you show genuine remorse, and if you compensate, and if the family says, okay, you can be exempted from the death penalty.
Well, remorse is a big thing here now.
Well, there are conversations in the bilateral dialogue, but there's some confusion because victims, of course, are involved in our criminal process, but sometimes the Chinese don't understand that how that it differs, that restitution is not your pain to get out of being executed.
Right.
Lori?
Yeah, I just want to bring it back to more the policy level, because you were talking about the EU dialogue. Can you give us some idea of what the EU is doing in comparison to the U.S. in terms of trying to promote human rights?
Well, excellent question, because one of the things there's some very critical opinion with respect to the value of these dialogues. Some take the position that they're nothing but talk shops, which have virtually no impact on human rights practices in China. Well, I'm not going to say whether that's the case with the United States. I can think of a few areas, sentence reduction and parole, for instance. But with respect to the EU, their number one issue has been the death penalty, always, and not just with China. They're very consistent with us too. They talk about it with us, and they're very critical. And one of their criticisms is because you practice it, you give cover to other countries like China to practice it. See, the United States. In fact, the Chinese have said that to me. Oh yeah, we should have a dialogue on the death penalty. We're in the same boat. It's not like the Europeans who are attacking us and from a position of purity. So yeah, and in fact, there has been a certain impact on death penalty reform from international criticism, especially the UN, the moratorium, and the Europeans. Yeah, there's been an impact. But again, here, this is a whole different topic, which I'd love to talk to you about sometime. We've gone from a say position 3-4 years ago, where there were 8 human rights dialogues, 2 of which the UK and the EU had sessions twice a year. Okay, and this, they were 2 to 3 day sessions involving site visits and legal seminars in the case of the Europeans on the side. And we have now, so we had 8. What do we got now? We're down to 6, I think. Norway's out, of course, because of the Nobel. That's finished.
Sorry, clarification, you're talking about official government
Yeah,
to government.
bilateral human rights dialogues, official bilateral rights, not consultations that, the Swedes have one of those. And this gets really interesting because the Chinese call, for instance, the Chinese call their dialogue, their discussions with Japan consultations, and the Japanese insist it's a dialogue. And I actually, there's a difference. If it's a dialogue, you can talk about human rights issues in China and they come back in your country. If it's a consultation, it's supposed to be about international human rights issues. The Sudan, North Korean refugees, let's talk to
No, Chinese naming.
the Chinese position is consultations cover international human rights issues. Bilateral dialogues, you can raise, cases. Now, they've become very, very good at limiting your ability to even do that. All right. But now the EU used to have twice a year, but starting in 2010, it's been reduced to once a year. And this last year, 2011, they had one round. The Europeans still want two. The Chinese have reduced it to one. And the Chinese argument is that, hey, remember something called the Lisbon Treaty? Foreign affairs is now handled out of Brussels. You've got a Lady Ashton, whatever her position is, but she's in charge of foreign affairs. And prior to that, when you had you still have the rotating presidency, but each presidency had a round of the dialogue. And so now, because it's 6 months, so you had twice a year. Now that you have a permanent foreign affairs establishment in Brussels, a unified foreign policy for the EU, even if they in practice might not have that, but the Chinese have said, okay, you get once a year, and the Europeans have been holding out and they don't get it. The UK, same. The UK gets once a year. They used to have twice a year. So we've got once a year for the EU, once a year.
Unified the government in the UK too?
What? No, it's just, I don't know why they did it with the UK. They just decided that once was enough for you guys. So anyway, EU, UK, Germany, Switzerland, United States, used to be Norway, Canada, Australia. Last year, Australia, first time since 1997, no round of the dialogue. And two have taken place in December.
And this is all a Chinese initiative.
Well, they had agreed to. It's pretty complicated, but the Australians have a dialogue at the ministerial level. So a vice minister handles it. In their case, it's Choi Tian-kai. So he represents China in the dialogue. And the Australians are very proud of that. But this last year, despite an initial understanding that it would take place in December, it didn't take place in December. Now, the official line is they couldn't agree on dates. Good to see you, Herb. Thanks for coming. I don't know. Were other factors involved? We just don't know. Was this agreement, to base Marines in northern Australia factored into it? I doubt the Chinese would have ever said so directly, but it can't be ruled out. China does practice linkage, in case you haven't noticed. So the U.S. gets once a year. The UK has just had theirs, just announced yesterday. They had a round in Nanking. The Brits have said nothing so far about it. The Chinese have announced China Daily. And so we're having, the dialogues continue, but often now, instead of 2 days, it's 1 day. Often now there are no site visits. And so the dialogue process has certainly been affected in recent years by various things. And on the one hand, so you have a critique in the West that these dialogues aren't very useful, and on the other hand, we have in China really a downgrading of the importance of the dialogues. At the same time, it appears that with respect to the UN, there's been some increase in cooperation, but there too, things are rather uncertain because the current High Commissioner is due, I think, in a few months to end her term, and she hasn't decided whether she wants to stay or not. And the Chinese are watching that. And I heard that the Russians are pushing to make the thematic mechanisms, the treaty bodies, intergovernmental, meaning that the governments appoint representatives to, say, arbitrary detention, whereas now they're independent experts reporting to the High Commissioner. If that happens, then you're going to find a dropping off there too. The Chinese have actually quite a good record of responding to inquiries. I mean, we may not like what we read, but they have a pretty good record of responding. I think my friend over there said they respond to about 80% of inquiries. Again, they say things that we find sort of hard to believe, if not accept. But that's so. The whole process of dialogue is very problematic right now. Whether and how to proceed. The U.S. last round in May in Beijing was pretty hard hitting. Mike Posner did a very good job, and I assume we're going to have another round this year, but it'll be in the United States. They alternate. And it's always a lot easier for the Chinese side to have the dialogue in the United States than it is in China.
We have reached the witching hour.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Thank you for attending.
Yeah,
We
I
will
really
adjourn.
enjoyed it. Thank you very much.